Welcome to the Pop Discourses, where we explore popular notions in the long conversation. I'm your host, Humboldt Ben. Oh yes, gather round ye all who would attend to the Flaming Heart. This is pilot episode 7 of the Pop Discourses. And today we're going to take a step back for, as I alluded to in a previous episode, when perusing the curious volume by Norman O. Brown entitled A Closing Time, which compares James Joyce's Finnegans Wake with Vico's, Giambattista Vico's The New Science, and consider the life of abstract metaphysics in language. And that is to raise the question of whether these phrases and terms and sentences, chapters, books, and collections of words that we deal with to engage and describe our realities have a life of their own. And as you'll remember, Professor Brown set out that with respect to abstractions or metaphysical principles, that besides the rational abstraction upon which science is based, there clearly is an abstraction of an emotional nature, which he suggests James Joyce is representing in the work that we've touched upon in a few episodes here, Finnegans Wake, with its parsed elementals and novel configurations of words. So I hadn't been able to find the part of Closing Time that suggests the power of language and its metaphysical language as a living thing, separate and apart from the reduction or abstraction that gives rise to it. Because we know if language does nothing else, it certainly has a categorical power where various qualities are reduced and represented by single words that transcend individual instances. Well, that seems plain enough on the surface, but once language and spirit have lodged in the mind, in the cultural mind, in the human mind, in the mind of an organization, the question then exists, what role do they play? And do these abstractions and metaphysics operate outside the realm that they ostensibly represent? So in concluding Closing Time, in a chapter called The New Science of Language, Professor Brown writes this: the language belongs to the people, and the poetry is in the language. Let it speak the id, das Buch von dem Es. In Homer, Goethe found eine Sprache, die für sich dicke und dinket, a language that in and by itself makes the poetry and does the thinking. That's the end of that passage. A language that does the thinking. That's really intriguing. Do we have a science that objectifies a language that does the thinking? I'm not sure that we do. Not at all. It makes the poetry and does the thinking. Well, looping back a little bit, there is the question in metaphysics of whether, besides the rational and the emotional, there may be a metaphysical voice founded in a feature of the human makeup that is correlated with identity, that perhaps the basic features of human nature, terms of the need for space, resources, and self-defense, and in the expression of perhaps some of the lesser qualities of humanity, the lust, the greed, the avarice, etc., that there is what I'll call an identity characteristic from which certain metaphysical expressions stem, and perhaps this is where a great opportunity for incongruity in word and action exists. Well, that's a lot. The Russian psychologist V.V. Nalimov, I should say the Russian psychologist and mathematician V.V. Nalimov, has written extensively on this question of the emotional quality of language. And this emotional dimension that can be held in the sign of certain words or concepts certainly points to something beyond the rational. So last couple weeks ago, we were talking about the Russian principle and the futurist of the early 20th century, the Zalm and how that could be translated as transrational or beyond thinking. And this perhaps begins to get to this point. We were comparing with the poet Larissa Shmalo, the emergence of the Zalm and the later emergence of the Finnegan's Wake and the similarities between the two. And here in the mid-70s and of the 20th century, in 1970 to about 1980, Vivian Nalimov was considering emotional features of certain words that were heightened and stood out against other words. And certainly that consideration could be thought of as the beginning of an objectification of the transrational. In particular, I'm referring to some of the conclusions drawn by Nalimov in a work translated in the United States entitled Realms of the Unconscious, The Enchanted Frontier. And in the foreword to that work, written by Robert G. Kolodny of the University of Pittsburgh, we find this sentence: "The language in which one captures aspects of reality is itself polymorphic, metaphorical, constrained by Gödelian principles of undecidability." So that's an acknowledgement that the direct rational correlation of certain concepts and abstractions is not fixed to a certain meaning as we'd like to have it in science, but that in reality, or in the trans-realistic position, what we see as potential in language nested in undecidability. And that is what I hope to call attention to in this episode. So, environment in which we live, which in my essay, A Ferocious Seahorse, pointing to the features of our media, I labeled the electrosphere. We are just inundated with words and concepts and threats and conclusions and generalizations, misdirections, outright lies. And of course, this electrosphere, to a large extent at this point, has been co-opted by political concerns. And so these considerations of the undecided or emotional components of language and their effects beyond the rational, where we might find fixed meanings, something that's clearly been recognized for over 100 years by the Russian futurist and by authors like James Joyce. And it's probably high time that we begin to draw these critical considerations more into the popular culture. Or at least that's my assessment. So, one of the conclusions that Nalimov comes to with respect to language is that certain words in comparison to other words have a greater emotional value, that their power is more dynamic, and their effects on the human organism are far more recognizable and expansive, or in the particular case that I'm going to cite, or profound, I should say, more generally, than the effects of other words not so emotionally charged. And the concept that he considers in particular that gives rise to elaboration in the human organism beyond what other words might trigger is the word for freedom. Of course, he did his work in Russia, but the translation applies, and the effects within the organism around the concept have this amplified response that is unique to the word and concept. Just one example, but in the terrain of language, the geography of language, the concept of freedom in his study has a pronounced response in imagination and biology, perhaps evoking the symbolism of a bird or the opening and expansion of a heart space that other words don't necessarily call forth. And there are other concepts, of course, that evoke these kind of heightened responses. And so in the mix, in the breach between the rational and the considerations of identity, these emotional spaces, these transrational responses are something that call attention to themselves. And that's what I'm talking about when we talk about a word or a concept having a life of its own. For certainly, we can imagine someone in a constrained situation, in prison, suffering perhaps in the alternative from health effects, or even in lockdown, quasi-quarantine, as it were, having a notion, independent of particular circumstances, of freedom and a relationship to self-expression, that the unhindered, unfettered self-expression that the concept of freedom engenders. Well, I believe that's the point I wanted to make today about the dynamism of certain abstract or metaphysical concepts, and how these concepts, once the conventions of their meaning are held somehow within a people, that they can have a life of their own, that they can be these are ideas that call people to certain ways of being, and these are ideas that call people to question certain impositions or restrictions or edicts that may arise, impacting them. Well, there you have it. Chop, chop. Drink up. It's closing time.
you.